I wish I could have met old Augustine's dad. I think I would have liked him. Here's what Augustine wrote about him. No one had anything but praise for my father. Despite slender resources, he provided me with everything that I needed. He was ready to give out of his own pocket what let me travel through my life. Many of our townspeople, far richer than my father, they went to no such trouble for their children's sake. Yet, my same father, he took no trouble to see how I was growing in God's sight. He cared only that I should have an honest tongue, a loving heart, and bore the godly fruits of my Father in heaven. How's that? In other words, he sowed the tiny mustard seeds in Augustine's moral garden. And that brings me to today's lesson. I want to talk about integrity. Heaven, said Jesus, is near. We live in a society where it's becoming harder and harder to find individuals that we can trust. Ask a businessman. He will tell you that good personnel is one of his greatest needs. Well, that's true in church, politics, your neighbor, school teachers, bankers. Do you know what's missing? Who can you count on? God's looking for people that are different. You know, the Bible's a wonderful book. It doesn't dodge these tough issues. It promises hope. If you look carefully, there's power. And there's also assurance for those weary soldiers who think they're losing the battle and living with guilt. My lesson today comes from Jesus' first sermon. It's the first one he preached, beginning his 3-year public ministry. Remember now, he's 30 years of age. Here's what he said. I didn't come to abolish the law, Matthew 5:17. I've come to fulfill it. Most of what Jesus taught dealt with integrity. I'm sure that's where Augustine's father got his teaching to pass it on to his son. From this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, don't murder, don't get angry, especially with your brother, don't commit adultery, don't even look lustfully on another woman. Jesus went further and said that if you looked with lust, that's just as bad as the act of adultery itself. And he backed it up with some strong hyperbole. If it's your eye that causes you to sin, he said, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now that word hell, it's not what you think it is. All the men sitting on that hillside that day listening to these words of Jesus, they just dropped their heads in embarrassment between their feet. The hell that Jesus was talking about was the word Gehenna. It was a place. Gehenna was the name of that large garbage dump, that smelly landfill on the northeast side of the city of Jerusalem. And it had a horrible reputation. Everybody knew it. Former kings of Israel, they treated that place as a bit of a holy grotto. Shrines were erected, and they were erected to foreign deities who placed their priests in there, and they practiced their idol worship. Child sacrifices were offered on those altars. Thousands of innocent lives were lost because of their wickedness. That's the center of Gehenna. Jesus was saying to these men in the audience on that mountain, If you look with lust on a woman and you think that's okay, well, it's not. You have just thrown your body into Gehenna. You've just blown your integrity, says Jesus. And he even went further, Matthew 5:30. And if your right hand causes you to sin, well, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown back into Gehenna. There's that word again. Jerusalem's hellhole, as some writers called it. By now, Jesus had every man in that hill sitting on the edge of their seat. What is he saying, Gehenna? With all that filth, stench. When he said that, he had every man's attention. Now, the law of Moses, way back in the beginning, it had three components. And Jesus' audience didn't understand it. He's going to explain it. And they're all ears because as they're sitting and they're listening, there's a stillness that creeps over that crowd as Jesus speaks. They've never heard anything like this before. They'd all gone to their little synagogues. They'd all listened to their rabbis, but their rabbis, none of them, came up with what they're going to hear now. Here were the 3 steps of the Old Testament that Jesus wanted them to remember. Here's the first one. Don't do it. Here's the second one. If you do it, here are the results. Now the third one, here was a sleeper. Do this instead. Step 1, external. Don't do it. Don't commit adultery. That's external. That's the act itself. Step 2, that's internal. If you look on a woman and you stare at her body and you desire it, that's as bad as the act. You've had an affair with her in your mind. That's internal. That's down in the heart. Now comes step 3. No one in Jesus' audience heard this before. Here's Jesus' do, not just don't, and not just if. He says, I want you to hang out with God. God's law starts with do. And it goes deeper than the law. It's not murder. It's peacemaking. It's not adultery or gazing with lust. You're looking at God's creation. That other woman, God created her in his image. Don't defile her. Something beautiful is being said here with this image that Jesus is speaking. That's the kingdom of God. That's what he's talking about. That's not something in Gehenna. Then Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is near. What did he mean by that? This do behavior is explained very well in 1 John 4. God has given us life, and from his life, from his very own Spirit, everyone that confesses Jesus is God's Son, here comes the do, participates in an intimate relationship with God himself. We embrace it, and we do it with heart and soul. And when we take up permanent residence in the life of love, we live in God and God lives in us. This way, love has the rule of the house. It becomes at home. We become right at home and mature in us so that we don't have to worry anymore. Well, those are the 3 steps. Don't, if, do. Love now having run the house. These men in Jesus' audience, they finally caught their breath. And they said to themselves, I think I can now finally hang out with God. Perfect love casts out fear. And love grows more perfect. You start doing what God wants you to do. The kingdom of heaven is near. And it all begins just like a tiny little mustard seed. And when his love takes hold, you become a peacemaker, not an adulterer. You make the first move. Jesus called that salt and light. And then he also said, you can't put a city on a hill with a light and it can't be seen. Now you become the light on the hill. No one that day on that side of the hill, hearing what Jesus was saying, could believe their ears. This was radical teaching, something they'd never heard before. Albert Einstein, he was a Jew, and he had a brilliant mind. And it was far more than science and the founder of atomic energy that I want you to hear. That man loved his Bible. He only had the Old Testament because he was a Jew. But he didn't know its meaning. Listen to this. Here's what he said. See if you agree. The most beautiful thing that we can experience is the mystery of God. It's the source of all true art, and it's the source of all true science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead, and his eyes are closed. He doesn't know the kingdom is near. Soren Kierkegaard, he told a parable about a rich man riding in a lighted carriage, drawn by a peasant who sat behind the horse in the cold and the dark, outside in the driver's seat. Because the rich man was inside, sitting in the artificial light of his oil lamp, he couldn't see anything outside of its beauty. That magnificent panorama of the stars out there in the heaven. The only one seeing that glorious view was the peasant, all alone, in front, sitting by himself, wrapped in majesty and wonder there behind his horse. He could see that the kingdom of heaven was near, and the rich man in the carriage, hidden, he didn't see anything. His little kingdom was a coal oil lamp and a few shadows. Well, most of today's world are just like that rich man, living in a world of internet with a tiny lamp and just staring at the shadows. What was it that made Jesus teach this? He shows you 3 steps to give you dignity and trust. No rabbi had ever said that before. Jesus pushed that behavior bar even higher. He said, life lived in the fullness of God. Go seek your brother and do the forgiving. Way back in Genesis 1:27, that's before the fall, the world was brand new. God had created it, and God made male and female in his image. And in the male and the female, God included himself, and that became the Trinity. When you get down to verse 28 of that first chapter, he told man, you're going to be the ruler over creation. You're going to be fruitful, and you're going to multiply. And you're going to fill the earth, and you're going to subdue it. You're going to rule over the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves. And God said, we're going to rule it together, you and me. God created the world out of nothing, but side by side, now man was going to rule with him. When you get to the 3rd chapter, suddenly there's a fall. Man falls into sin. And instead of ruling the world together, man said, I'm going to rule it by myself. I don't need God. I'll just do the ruling. And what does God do? He said to mankind, both male and female, you're going to pay a terrible price for this. Here's what he said to man, and then he said to woman. Man, cursed is the ground because of you. You're going to endure now painful toil all the days of your life. And it'll produce thorns and thistles for you. And by the sweat of your brow, you're going to eat from your own growth, your own food. You'll return to the ground, to the dust from which you were returned. And then he said to the woman, I will greatly increase your pains in childbirth. Your desire will be for your husband, and he'll rule over you. And for them, from then on, the kingdom of heaven was never near. Along comes Jesus. He's teaching this crowd. He probably reminded of this, his audience. He told them it was probably the most sad experience ever written in Scripture. And then he said to them, I'm longing for you to see the other side of that. I have come because the kingdom of heaven is near, and you're looking at it. And when this happens, men and women together, they're not going to be used. They're not going to be lusted after. They're going to be together, again, as one. And when his kingdom comes, and it comes, those are going to be your new dues. And it's going to start very small. It's going to be like a little tiny mustard seed. And it's the tiniest of all the little growing seeds, and yet it's going to grow into a tree. And the birds of the air are going to come and nest in their branches. That's when the kingdom of heaven is near. I teach a class every Sunday morning. And in my class, I have a whole group that's full of mustard seeds. And I've watched their lives start small. And from those seeds, I've watched them become giant trees. And in the branches of those trees, I see love and joy and peace and long-suffering and gentleness. And I see the kingdom of heaven is near. Joseph Haydn was a very famous musician. He started as a tiny mustard seed. And when he was born, he suffered from a choanal atresia. It was a blockage of his nostrils. He had nasal polyps. And there wasn't any treatment for that. And as a result, that was his handicap all his life. He could hardly breathe. And he wasn't a very handsome man. He never commissioned a portrait of himself because he didn't feel worthy. And whatever personality quirks that the other famous artists had, like good looks, conceitedness, arrogance, irreverence, Haydn didn't have that. The man was shy, fairly withdrawn, humble, good-mannered, and he was simply the product of a very simple origin. He was the son of a wheelwright. Do you know what a wheelwright was? His dad was a wagon wheel maker. He made the rims and he made the spokes for the carriages and the coaches of his day, 300 years ago. He didn't grow up in a musician's family. Joseph grew up in the home where there wasn't any music. There was no stimulant at all. Well, who was this Joseph? Franz Haydn. Why was he remembered? Well, he was born in Austria in 1732. And he started out as a little choir boy, trained on the violin, supported himself as a musician and a teacher, and he taught students. Two of his students were little brats. One was called Beethoven and the other was Mozart. Haydn, self-taught in the discipline of counterpoint and composition, he launched his career. And here's what he did over his lifetime. When his life was over, he had composed over 100 symphonies, 70 string quartets, and then he created the Viennese Baroque and Romantic music. And in his lifetime, he's going to become one of the greatest composers of his age. From a father, a wheelwright, to the most famous musician of the age. How'd he do it? Here was his secret. In life, sometimes it's not what you know. Instead, it's who you know. Remember Haydn's character. Very humble. He was prudent, good-mannered, but shy. He exercised sound judgment, however, and he managed his life very carefully. And he also had self-confidence. And then his kingdom of music came near. 1761, at the age of 29, all those qualities that I just described, they caught the eye of the wealthiest and most powerful family in Hungary. And that family saw that tiny little mustard seed in that man called Haydn. His name was Prince Paul Esterhazy. Now, Esterhazy, if you're from Saskatchewan, you've got a town named after him. The prince had just finished a brand new palace, and it was called the Little Versailles, the jewel of all Hungary. The prince wanted Haydn to be his new composer there in residence. And he was given his own little apartment. He could choose his own resident orchestra to play along with the music he was going to write. And there was going to be a 400-seat opera house, beautiful court chapel. The new palace contained 100 guest rooms, large library, and an art gallery. And in this perfect setting, the prince turned Haydn loose. In other words, go do your work. I want you to hit up an orchestra if you want. You can experiment with all kinds of music if you want. I want you to compose. I want you to write some sacred masses for my church. Write operas for the theater. And in 2 of the large music rooms, create symphonies and some chamber music. Would you do that for me? Here was the little man coming from this wheelwright background and asked to do that. That tiny mustard seed grew into a giant tree. Chamber music, symphonies, was going to lodge on its branches. Haydn became the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet. But he himself was never a father, married, no kids. When he stopped composing in 1803, he died 6 years later. But he amassed a considerable wealth with no kids to leave it to. What do you think he did with it? His wealth was generously distributed among the poor, the children at school, and little orphans. Here was this poor, humble upstart, self-conceived musician who promoted the finest music in the remotest land. Haydn began as a tiny little mustard seed, taught students, paid just enough to exist, and then the kingdom opened up for him, and a benefactor trusted in him to set him free, to become a new creature in music. His works are played in the best orchestras and the best choirs and the best quartets all over the world now, and the kingdom of music came near. When Jesus preached his first sermon that day on the side of the mountain, he said, the kingdom of heaven is near. It's not what you know. It's who you know, like Haydn. Jesus wants you to accept him as the who you know. After Jesus had finished his message,